Um, the theme, Wisdom of the Earth, Our Way into a Viable Future for All, is a follow-up to the homily that I preached back on September 15th, when I drew from the reading in Proverbs, where wisdom calls out from the rooftops, her desperate warning to listen up. A series of presentations that continue to invite us to embrace a deep spiritual conversion, a time when we shift our focus towards all of God's creation as a sacred reality, and a time to reflect upon the earth as an important revelatory expression of the divine. The subject and timing of this fall's OMG Tuesday series could not be more appropriate. I think that we are all coming to an awareness that there is a sense of urgency in our current situation. With every new day, we are learning more and more about the negative consequences of global warming and climate change. The increased frequency and devastating power of hurricanes, the increased frequency and extent of wildfires, storm surges, droughts, rising sea levels, loss of shelf ice. I could go on and on. In fact, just this morning, I read that the damage costs due to hurricanes in Florida have doubled every decade since the 1990s. So for the 2020s, it's like, eightfold. So we are finally coming into consciousness that we must make drastic changes to the way in which we relate to the earth if our children, and indeed the children of all living species, are going to have a viable future that is worth inheriting. During this first Tuesday, I will attempt to address the question of how we got here in the first place and discuss some of the theological implications that our biblical cosmology evokes. So we will begin with how our misinterpretation of Genesis has led us to a radical disconnect between humans and nature, and how this disconnect has further legitimized the abuse of nature. As cultural historian Father Thomas Berry would say, the main reason that we find ourselves in such ecological chaos is that we are in between stories. We are out of touch with our true and larger self. Our lives remain rooted in our biblical cosmology, even as a new scientific and spiritual creation story is being articulated that can be understood as the basis for a new cosmology, a new sacred story. For this presentation, I will be drawing upon the work of Father Thomas Berry, Miriam McGillis, who is co-founder of Genesis Farm, and Michael Dowd, a veteran ecologist as well as a peace and justice activist and pastor of St. Paul's United Church of Christ in Woodsfield, Ohio. A people's creation story influences their experience of everything. As Thomas Berry has observed, for peoples generally, their story of the universe and the human role within the universe is their primary source of intelligibility and value. Only through the story of how the universe came to be in the beginning and how it came to be as it is, does a person come to appreciate the meaning of life or to derive the psychic energy needed to deal effectively with those crisis moments that occur in the life of the individual and in the life of the society. Such a story communicates the most sacred of mysteries and not only interprets the past, but it also guides and inspires our shaping of the future. Okay. So it would be difficult to overstate the impact that the biblical cosmology and creation narrative of the Bible has had on the thinking and institutions of Western society. A quick look at some of the traditional interpretations of the biblical story might help elucidate this. From a straightforward reading of Genesis, we developed the following beliefs. We were placed on a fixed, ready-made earth over which we were to have dominion. Human exceptionalism became for us an a priori value that informed how we related to God, to self, to others, and God's creation. We were made in the image of God, who is transcendent to creation, God in the heavens above. We were called to be in spiritual relationship with God. This relationship was ultimately the only thing that mattered. Our life on earth was meant to prepare us for the next life in union with God. Other living things were material and not spiritual. Only humans had souls Therefore, nothing else really mattered. Nature was in a corrupt state due to the fall of Adam and Eve. Creation was seen for its instrumental value, that is, how it could be exploited or used for the benefit of humankind, rather than for its intrinsic value as an expression of the divine goodness and integral to the ecosystems that support all life on Earth. So I don't know if any of you have ever seen David Suzuki lecture. Has anyone seen David Suzuki lecture? So I've heard him speak several times, and often he will share a story that he has regarding being in a conversation with the CEO of a major lumber company that was cutting down old growth forests in BC. And obviously, David Suzuki was there to try to convince him otherwise, right? And they were sort of going back and forth for a while. And finally, the CEO kind of points his finger at David Suzuki's head and says, "Mr. Suzuki, you don't get it. Those trees have no value until I cut them down." So that's what I mean about a worldview that sees everything else out there as strictly a commodity to be used for the benefit of humankind. So whereas the CEO was trained to see the forest as so many board feet of wood or so many rolls of toilet paper or, packages of computer paper, David Suzuki went, "Oh my God, no wonder we can't, see eye to eye, because when I look at the forest, I see habitat. I see a heat sink. I see a carbon sink. I see how the earth participates in transpiration. I see root systems that secure and support the soil and regenerate the soil and prevent mudslides and erosion and all of those things." So that's what I mean about seeing the distinction between instrumental and intrinsic value. In fact, Thomas Berry would say that the problem with the American Constitution is it gave all the rights to the human, when in fact, everything as an expression of God's creation deserves their own constitution of rights. So whereas tree rights and stream rights and animal rights are different than human rights, they have rights that need to be protected in order to ensure the ongoing viability of all life on the planet. So the final thing was that we knew that God would eventually restore creation to its original perfection at the end of time. They would create this 1,000-year time of peace, and the earth would be restored to its pre-fall Garden of Eden state. So these beliefs form the presuppositional core of virtually every institution in the West. Western law, politics, commerce, medicine, and education all emerge out of this foundational cosmological story. These beliefs have enabled and empowered us to make the discoveries and gains that we have made today. Dominion over gave us the freedom to probe and explore nature, to discover how God created things. Because we saw ourselves as separate from and superior to the rest of the natural world, we had the detachment necessary for the empirical scientific tradition to emerge and progress as it did in the West. Our cosmology gave us the freedom to develop a wide variety of technologies, such as the telescope and microscope, enabling us to learn how the universe worked. It also inspired us to reduce or fix some of the perceived imperfections of nature. The vision of helping to bring about the perfection that God would restore at the end of time has allured and empowered us. Indeed, the history of the West can be understood as a process of learning ever more about the natural world and developing technology to bring about less suffering and hardship and more comfort, convenience, and longer life. In other words, used in service of transcending the human condition. Thomas Berry would describe this as the millennial myth, our desire to bring into being Wonder World. We got tired of waiting for God to reappear sometime in the Enlightenment and decided to take on the task of creating the promise of 1,000-year time of peace and happiness all on our own. Our entire consumer-oriented existence is the means by which this is to be accomplished. But what we have failed to realize until recently is that what we're actually creating is waste world. So when all our corporations look at their economic equations, they fail to include what's called externalities. And externalities are that part of the equation that includes devastation to ecosystems, pollution of adjacent water streams, pollution of the air, landfill, all the kind of things that are not factored in to the bottom line. And yet the Earth has been keeping her own spreadsheet. And it's clear that payback time is beginning to emerge. According to Miriam McGillis, a people's cosmology or origin story predates everything else that they create by way of culture, religion, economics, politics, and so on. So if we want to find ways to build community and achieve sustainability and a viable presence on the planet, perhaps we need first to find a new story that will inspire and energize us to transformation. Over the next 4 weeks, we will draw from several resources to assist us in this task. So as a prelude to next week, we will revisit scripture and the lives of early saints and mystics in order to reclaim that part of our Christian tradition that understood creation as a sacred reality and revelatory of the divine.